Hello, and welcome to the Middle East Institute's Book Talk. My name is Jerry Firestein, and I am the Senior Vice President here at the Institute. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Kitty Harvey to discuss her new book, A Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. In her book, Dr. Harvey explores the decision-making process in Saudi Arabia that led to the decision, despite entreaties from the Iraqis, from the United States, and even from policy advisors within the Saudi government, to refuse to normalize relations with Iraq following the US invasion in 2003. The book explores not only the consequences of the Saudi decision, the self-fulfilling prophecy of the book's title, but also the psychology of decision-making. The book could not be timelier, in my view, as we are witnessing at this moment the same psychological effects of Vladimir Putin's ill-fated decision to invade Ukraine. Kitty's book is available for purchase on Amazon, and a little bit later on in the program, we will be posting in the chat function discount codes that you can use to purchase it. Dr. Harvey is a Navy veteran and a scholar of the Middle East. She completed her PhD in Middle Eastern Studies at King's College London. While in the Navy, Dr. Harvey served as an intelligence officer in the CENTCOM and EUCOM areas of responsibility, as well as at sea aboard the amphibious assault ship USS Wasp. Dr. Harvey earned her BA in History and International Studies from Yale and an MA in International Relations and International Economics with a focus on strategic studies from Johns Hopkins SAIS. While at SAIS, Dr. Harvey was a research assistant to our old friend, Professor Elliot Cohen, assisting with his 2011 book, Conquered into Liberty, 2 Centuries of Battles Along the Great Warpath That Made the American Way of War, which is probably not one of the ones that Dr. Cohen wants to advertise these days. Dr. Harvey is currently a member of the SAIS Board of Advisors, as well as an adjunct assistant professor in the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University. For our audience, you can submit questions for Dr. Harvey through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. For those following on YouTube, you can email your questions to events@mei.edu. Dr. Harvey, welcome again. And let me invite you to kick off the program with some introductory comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you to the Middle East Institute for hosting me this morning. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to speak a little bit about my new book. And I thought that I would start my comments with just explaining a little bit about how I came to this topic that is the post-2003 relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And so the book actually, it really began its life as my PhD dissertation. And so when I was at the beginning of my PhD research, when I was at the stage of really kind of digging into my primary research, and this was back in early 2015, what I was doing at that stage was I was going through just a huge volume of news reporting from the Arab world from the period that I was looking at. And that period was the years between the 2003 invasion of Iraq leading up to the eve of the Arab Spring. So the 2003 to 2010 period. The book then goes beyond the Arab Spring and to the present day, but 2003 to 2010 was what I was really looking at that time. And as I was going through this news reporting, what I was finding, particularly for 2007 and 2008, and it was a real surprise to me, actually, what I was finding was that a range of Iraqi leaders, Shia leaders, Sunni leaders, Kurdish leaders, they were all making statements to the effect that they wanted to reintegrate Iraq into the Arab world, and that they wanted, in particular, to build a relationship with Saudi Arabia. And they were making statements to the effect of, we want better relations with the Arab world, and we want better relations with Saudi Arabia in particular, because Saudi Arabia is our gateway back into the Arab world. And this was a surprise to me because, quite frankly, it had just been my assumption that Iraq post-2003, with the empowerment of the Iraqi Shia, it was just my assumption that the new Iraq was sort of naturally more aligned with Iran. So it was a surprise that what I was finding were the Iraqis reaching out to Saudi Arabia. And meanwhile, with regard to the Saudis, it was also surprising for the same period. What was really even more surprising was that the Saudis were making no ostensible effort. So as I could tell from news reporting, the Saudis were making no ostensible effort to reciprocate the Iraqi outreach. And that was a surprise because, of course, I knew that the Saudis were, deeply concerned about Iranian influence in Iraq at this point. And I would have thought that, engaging with these Iraqis would have given them a way to, start to help limit Iranian influence in Iraq. But so that was the dynamic that I was finding, the Iraqis reaching out, the Saudis being really standoffish. And it was just really confusing to me. And as I continued in my research and I started doing interviews, and I did a whole bunch of interviews with Iraqis, with Saudis, and with a whole bunch of Americans as well. What I found, as Jerry sort of just mentioned, what I found with regard to the Americans was that the Bush administration, and subsequently the Obama administration too, but of course I was focused on kind of this earlier period, the Bush administration was putting tremendous pressure on the Saudis to engage with Iraq, and senior Bush administration officials, and even George W. Bush himself, were weighing in with Saudi leaders, and in particular King Abdullah, the late King Abdullah, who at the time was the ultimate decision maker in the Saudi system, and was also really very personally, was personally responsible for the Saudi decision not to normalize relations with Iraq, not to engage with Iraq. These senior U.S. officials were weighing in with them, and it wasn't changing the Saudis' course at all. The Saudis were still refusing to engage. And so this became the puzzle that I sought to address in my research and in the book. And the research question really became, so why was it that the Saudis made a decision not to engage with Iraq in the years after 2003? And furthermore, what was the impact of that decision on Iraq itself? And my principal argument, and I should say that there's a widespread perception that Iraq post 2003 was sort of naturally aligned with Iran, that the Maliki government in particular was sort of naturally aligned with Iran. And I actually push back on that. My argument is that it was not a foregone conclusion that a Shia-led Iraq would gravitate to an Iranian camp, to an Iranian regional axis. And that this did in fact come to pass, that Iraq did end up in an Iranian camp, I argue is really a result of a self-fulfilling prophecy created by the Saudis, and in particular created by the late King Abdullah, who again was responsible really for the decision not to engage with Iraq. And so what accounts for the Saudi decision? I argue that deeply ingrained beliefs, and I explore these beliefs in detail in the book, but very deeply ingrained beliefs about Iran and about the Arab Shia predisposed Saudi leaders to really forming a perception after 2003 that Iran was taking over Iraq. And these beliefs are that Iran is inherently expansionist, that Iran inherently seeks to expand in the region, and also a belief that tends to see the Arab Shia as loyal to Iran. And of course, that's a fairly standard stereotype of the Arab Shia among many Arab Sunnis. But so those beliefs predisposed Saudi leaders, and in particular Abdullah, to seeing to really perceiving that Iran was turning Iraq into a sort of vassal state, And in particular, Abdullah really came to regard Nouri al-Maliki, who became prime minister in 2006, and of course remained in the premiership through 2014. Abdullah really saw Maliki as nothing but an Iranian agent, or really even an Iranian puppet, really in those terms. I argue, and I think I demonstrate in the book, that the Saudi perceptions about Iraq and about Maliki were really basically incorrect. With regard to Maliki, it is not my intention to defend Maliki. He certainly had plenty of serious shortcomings as prime minister. He was authoritarian. He was not somebody who was interested in sharing power. He certainly took at times very sectarian positions, but he was not actually an Iranian client. He had actually been somebody who had long been skeptical towards Iran. And when he became prime minister in 2006, he really was independent of Iran, and was somebody who was looking to establish Iraq as independent of Iran. He was not anti-Iran, but he was not in its pocket, so to speak. He was not a client of Iran. The Saudi, again, the Saudi refusal to normalize with Iraq, the Saudi decision to isolate Iraq, ended up having sort of two consequences. First, on a basic level, it cut off Iraq's access to the Arab world, which only made Iraq more dependent on Iran, of course, not really having access to its Arab neighbors. But secondly, and this is the more important point for my book, the Iraqis came to Maliki, other members of his government, and many Iraqis across the country really came to interpret the Saudi decision not to normalize as a deep Saudi hostility to Iraq's new Shia-led order, and also even as a Saudi intention to reverse Iraq's post-2003 Shia ascendance. So the Iraqis really became, or at least many Iraqis, came to feel very threatened. Maliki was beginning to express, starting in 2007, Maliki himself had begun to express considerable concern about the Saudis, and his concerns deepened considerably at the time of Iraq's 2010 parliamentary elections, and then really reached sort of new heights after the Arab Spring. And it was after the Arab Spring that the Maliki government really did come into alignment with Iran. But again, I argue that that was not a result of some affinity that Maliki or other members of his government had for Iran, but was really a result of the threat they felt from Saudi Arabia. And so with that, I will end my remarks, and I look forward to answering your questions. But before I do, I just want to point out that the story that I tell really comes to an end in 2015 with the death of King Abdullah and the ouster of Nouri al-Maliki. And in recent years, the Saudis have changed course. And in the last year or two in particular, Saudi Arabia and Iraq really have begun to engage in important ways. And so that I will turn it back over to Jerry. Jerry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you for the introductory comments and for kind of laying out the themes of the book. It strikes me that really there are two main strands, two main directions in the book that are important to explore. One is the impact in the broader Middle East of Abdullah's decision not to try to bring Iraq back into the Arab fold, not to explore possibilities, and what has that meant in terms of Iran's ability to expand its influence in the region. Did that initial success in Iraq actually open the door for further Iranian plays in the region, Syria, Yemen, etc. And then, of course, the other part is the psychology, Abdullah's psychology. What was it that led him to believe that he couldn't compete, that he or Saudi Arabia was better off, giving the cold shoulder to the Iraqis as opposed to trying to get in and support the transition, and what do those kinds of misconceptions that you talk about on the part of Abdullah, what does that tell us about leaders' psychology and the impact of decision making? And as I mentioned in the introduction, of course, we can look at those effects real time every day as we try to figure out what it was that Vladimir Putin was thinking when he thought that invading Ukraine would be a good idea. So to go back to the first one, and as we were chatting a little bit before the program started, you had referenced Abdullah's trauma from the 1980s, from the Iran-Iraq War, when he was, one of the senior princes, the commander of the Saudi National Guard, eventually, of course, became the crown prince under King Fahd, in the post-Iran revolution period, the first great trauma that the Arab world suffered was, in fact, the Iran-Iraq War and what happened there. And if you could talk a little bit about how that affected Abdullah and might have influenced his decisions later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was telling Jerry before the program began that, even before I began my primary research and I was going through all that news reporting that I was talking about, one of the first things that I really did in my PhD was I learned a lot about the 1980s, which means that I also learned a lot about the Iran-Iraq War. And I am not from the region. I was learning a lot. I came to all of this with open eyes. I was learning all of this from books and also from talking to people and such. But what I discovered in the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War, was deeply traumatic, needless to say, for Iran and for Iraq. But I believe that it was also deeply traumatic for Saudi Arabia. And there were four important people at the top of the Saudi leadership at that time: King Fahd, Crown Prince Abdullah, Prince Sultan, who was Minister of Defense and Aviation, and Prince Nayef, who was Minister of Interior. At the beginning of what was an interesting dynamic to me, and actually it reflected sort of some of the later dynamics between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, in the post-2003 period. What I discovered when I was really kind of like digging into the research about the early 80s, after the Iranian Revolution and actually after the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War, the Saudis were projecting trying to project more neutrality between Iran and Iraq, and actually even made sort of efforts to reach out to the Islamic Republic and even to sort of reach out to Khomeini. I mean, they didn't think that they were going to be friends, but they were saying things like, we're Islamic, we're brothers, we both adhere to Islamic values, blah, blah, and Khomeini just, had them in his crosshairs from the get-go, just really incendiary rhetoric. That just convinced the Saudis that the Iranians were out to get them. Iraq very much started the war in 1980 by invading Iran. But 2 years later, the Iraqi invasion kind of quickly came to a stalemate. 2 years later, the Iranians took the war into Iraq. And from 1982 to 1988, the war was really fought on Iraqi soil. And the Iranians launched something like 25 offensives into Iraq during that period, all under the banner of, toppling Saddam. And, and they even, in 1982, they explicitly made statements to the effect of, we're invading Iraq, we're going to establish an Islamic Republic in Iraq, Iran and Iraq will come together and the rest of the region will follow. And, needless to say, this was this was deeply concerning, deeply threatening to the Saudis. It is completely understandable why the Saudis felt that the Islamic Republic and Khomeini had it out for them. But again, going to kind of the psychological piece, political psychologists say, Robert Jervis wrote this, in particular in his magisterial perception and misperception in international politics, that wars can become traumatic events that often become prisms through which we continue to see our adversaries even when circumstances change. So the war finally came to an end in 1988. Khomeini died in 1989. The Iranians, largely turned inward. Were focused on reconstruction. New, more moderate leaders came to power in Iran. It's not like there weren't still significant issues between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that Iran didn't continue to kind of make trouble. But the Saudis really sort of, and I explore this in the book, the Saudis really got locked into seeing Iran through that lens of the Iran-Iraq war kind of for the years after. And I think that today, that sort of image of Iran that really sort of had its genesis in the Iran-Iraq war has just been sort of kind of locked in. It really has just become sort of taken for granted in Saudi Arabia. So in any case, the Saudis really felt kind of deeply traumatized by the events in the 1980s, and it really continued to color their decision making, for the years thereafter, up until the present day. So that may be more than you were expecting me to talk about the Iran-Iraq war, Jerry.
No, it's really interesting, and and again how the impact falls. I would also mention, I think it's not only the Iran-Iraq war; it was also, of course, right after the Iranian Revolution that the Iranians also tried to intervene and promote a revolt against the Bahraini leadership.
Yeah.
And so there were, they were creating problems in the region, in Kuwait and Bahrain.
Absolutely.
So those things were going on, but it's very interesting because, of course, we talk about the impact of these events, and I was in Riyadh in the mid 1980s, in the midst of the conflict. I was the political military officer at the embassy.
Oh, wow.
When we did the Kuwait reflagging, and so I know how deeply impacting the war was on Saudi attitudes, and of course the beginning of the Gulf Cooperation Council and all these other things. But one of the interesting things here is that despite these traumas, you can look in comparison to Kuwait, which suffered an invasion by Saddam Hussein in 1990-91, suffered much more than the Saudis did, and yet were much more willing to accommodate Maliki in that post-invasion history, perhaps because they saw Saddam Hussein as their nemesis, and because the Kuwaitis don't have those strong views about Sunni Shia issues that the Saudis do, and especially that Abdullah did as an individual leader. And so how leaders respond to these various events is quite different, and really can shape national policies.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. And I show in the book, the Kuwaitis had a much more flexible approach to Iraq. I find the comparison between Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and actually Abdullah of Jordan to be really interesting, because quite frankly, at the beginning, in those early years after 2003. All of Iraq's neighbors were pretty deeply alienated about what had gone, about the U.S. invasion of Iraq, about the U.S. effectively just dismantling Saddam Hussein, the Ba'athist regime, and in late 2004, the Jordanians were actually the most vocal, at least they were very publicly vocal about their just serious anxiety about what was going on in Iraq. That was the point where Abdullah of Jordan coined the term Shia crescent. He and other Jordanian leaders, were saying, Iran, all the same things that the Saudis believe, that Iran was taking over Iraq, making efforts to take over Iraq, and it was also clear that the Jordanians were looking at this through the prism. We're really equating Iraq's Shia ascendance with an Iranian takeover. So the Jordanians at first had all the same anxieties that the Saudis did, but over the course of in 2005, in the course of maybe a 9-month period, they sort of just completely flip-flopped. And then the Jordanians became the Arab neighbor that was at the forefront of engaging with the new Iraq. And there, all this rhetoric about Iran is taking over, went out the window. And I argue that, for the Jordanians, the Jordanians were not thrilled about what was going on in Iraq, about these major changes, but they recognized that these major changes were taking place, and that that wasn't going to be reversed. And Jordan's principal objective was to maintain the relationship, the economic relationship that they had built with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So if Iraq was now under Shia leadership, was now kind of led by its Shia majority, the Jordanians were going to adapt, because they had to adapt, because the economic relationship was just so vital for them. And that just need was really what, I argue, pushed the Jordanians to adapt so quickly. By contrast, and by 2008, most of Iraq's other Arab neighbors were beginning to engage in meaningful ways. They had been, the UAE, Egypt, other Arab states, began to reopen their embassies, began to put together, new trade agreements, began to send senior officials to take trips to Baghdad, just to kind of, show Arab support. And so by about that period, 2008, the Saudis were really the only neighbor, the only Arab neighbor that wasn't doing that. I guess Qatar wasn't either, but the Saudis were the important player. And I argue that these beliefs about Iran, as you say, kind of the Sunni Shia views kind of just seem to be particularly deep among the Saudis. And the third component was also on the part of Abdullah, I've got to say, deep grievance towards the United States. And I think that also very much colored his decision making, is that Abdullah and other Saudi leaders, but Abdullah in particular, had really implored the Bush administration not to invade Iraq. And he really felt very deeply aggrieved when the Americans not only invaded Iraq, but then did so in a way that really from the Saudi point of view, really flouted Saudi interests. So with when the Americans, senior members of the Bush administration then came to the Saudis and came to Abdullah, and compelled him, urged him, implored him to normalize with Iraq, that sort of deep emotion on Abdullah's part, that grievance towards the Americans was absolutely a factor in Abdullah saying no, that, the Americans had not taken Saudi interests into account with the changes that the Americans had put into place, set into motion in Iraq. And Abdullah, wasn't interested in playing, wasn't interested in being flexible, quite frankly.
Which raises another issue, because the other aspect about it, of course, was the idea, that certainly was a motivator for the American decision to invade Iraq. And that was this whole idea of democratization in the Middle East. And you mentioned the effect of the Arab Spring, and how Iraq and Saudi Arabia responded to that. But certainly, the rhetoric coming out of Washington at the time that we made the decision to overthrow Saddam was highly political, in a sense that would have been very unnerving for the Saudis. Because they would have, even though there was a lot of talk about, from here to Tehran, the Saudis would have had to have looked at this as threatening to their legitimacy and their own government going forward. And that would have only increased, of course, their concerns about what the Maliki evolution would mean for them, right?
Absolutely. And absolutely. And what was really interesting also, again, about the book, of course, is primarily about Saudi Arabia and Iraq, but, the Americans are such a, if Saudi Arabia and Iraq are the protagonists, Iran and the United States are not far behind. And so there's also a real focus on the Saudi-US relationship in the book. Because of course the U.S. put all of this into motion with the invasion of Iraq, and the book, it kind of explores the Saudis' reaction to those events that were put into motion. And what I found sort of fascinating with regard to the U.S.-Saudi piece, in the 1990s, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia had basically been on board. There had basically been an agreement about what they wanted to see happen in Iraq. The George H.W. Bush administration and the Bill Clinton administration. After, I think that there was a hope, during the 1990-1991 Gulf War, that that Saddam would fall. That the war was so humiliating that that Saddam Hussein would fall from power as a result, that there would be a palace coup. Kind of like we hope that there might be a palace coup in Moscow at the present day. But in any case, there was not a palace coup. And of course, Saddam Hussein remained in power in Baghdad. And so that was, of course, a problem. Because Saddam Hussein, of course, had started, not one, but two wars. And in the 1990s, the US had a covert policy of trying to foment a coup in Baghdad, to foment that palace coup. And the US was very much working, with Saudi Arabia, I believe with Jordan, with other Arab partners, to try to make that coup happen. And of course, the coup never happened. When, in the wake of, but again, with the Clinton policy and the Bush the father policy was, the coup wasn't aiming at democracy. The idea was to keep, a Sunni Arab dictator, autocrat in power in Baghdad, and Iraq would continue to be, sort of a bulwark against Iran. That, a Sunni Arab autocrat in Baghdad would continue to balance Iran in the region. And that was very much the way that the Saudis saw Iraq. And of course, the Saudis just in general are not huge believers in democracy. But the Sunni Arab autocrat in Baghdad was definitely how the Saudis saw things. And then in the wake of September 11th, U.S. policy changed dramatically towards Iraq, and of course there had been moves afoot in neoconservative circles in the late 1990s in Washington to change policy towards Iraq. But in any case, after September 11th, the policy, of course, became, a coup is not effective. That hasn't worked. We now need to invade Iraq because Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And we also have to, or we should establish democracy in Baghdad, and that can create this sort of ripple effect in the region. And so, within just this very short period of time, U.S. policy had changed really, fundamentally from, just keep a Sunni Arab autocrat in power in Baghdad to we need to democratize Iraq. And I think at the moment of the invasion, I think that the Saudis didn't actually have a good understanding, because, I'm not sure that everybody in the United States had a good understanding that the goal was democracy now. But I don't think I think the Saudis still expected, and what they were communicating to the Americans was what they had always communicated with the Americans in the 1990s, keep the regime in place. Yes, get rid of Saddam, get rid of his top lieutenants, but keep the regime in place. Make sure that, Iraq remains that bulwark against Iran. So when in the aftermath of the invasion, the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad, the US-led entity led by Paul Bremer, began to dismantle the regime, the Ba'athist regime, and not only dismantle the Ba'athist regime, but then put it into place this ethno-sectarian formula for Iraqi governance. I think that's at the point where the Saudis really started to conclude that that the Americans had handed Iraq over to Iran, and that's what they really began to say. And that phrase, the U.S. has handed Iraq to Iran on a silver platter or a golden platter in Arabic, silver platter in English. The Saudis really began to use that phrase in 2003. I think in the summer and fall of 2003, they began to form a conclusion that the Americans had effectively allowed Iran to become empowered in Iraq and to kind of start to take over the country. And going back to the psychological piece, political psychologists tell us that, human beings don't like uncertainty. And we have a tendency just in general to form conclusions before there's really adequate information to support that conclusion. It's hard to keep an open mind is basically the point. It's much more comfortable to form a conclusion, to form a perception, and to say that's the way that it is. But the Saudis, and really at that early stage, kind of post-invasion in 2003, formed a conclusion that the U.S. had handed Iraq over to Iran, through these fundamental changes, and I argue that kind of forming that perception and kind of closing their mind to that point, and not kind of keeping an open mind to be able to really actually see what was going on in Iraq, that was ultimately something that was very counterproductive for the Saudis, that they became very rigid after 2003 because they weren't open to really seeing what was going on in Iraq.
Well, I think, maybe for your for volume 2 of your trilogy, it would be interesting for you to write a similar, kind of analysis of the decision making among, Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld, and what their motivations were,
Yeah,
because I think that the psychology there, it was at least as notable as psychology in Riyadh.
yeah,
But at the same time, and you mentioned, the two, kind of very close, observers to what was going on were here in Washington, but also in Tehran. And how do you see, I mean, how were the Iranians reacting to what they saw? I mean, they must have concluded that this was, for the Saudis, basically an own goal, right? That speaking of being handed things on platters, that they were being handed Iraq on a platter, because the Saudis were simply not there.
yeah. I think that's absolutely the case, that this really kind of played into the Iranians' hands. And I will say, so I'll say that the book absolutely explores kind of Iranian interference in Iraq, but the book is really about Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and I'm less expert, I should say, in sort of the Iran-Iraq relationship. There are a lot of people out there who know far more than I do about the Iran-Iraq relationship, which of course is a hugely complex topic on its own. But what was interesting to me, and I kind of say this as kind of tentatively, or that in the research that I did, it was never clear to me, kind of 2003 onwards, I think the Saudi point of view was that, Iran was taking over Iraq, and Iran wanted Iraq to be pulled into the Iranian camp, and Iran didn't want to share. Iran, wanted Iraq for itself. I think that was very much the Saudi point of view. I will only say sort of tentatively, because I don't know exactly what Iranian intentions were. I explore Iranian intentions in the book, but in my research, it was never clear to me that was the Iranian objective. It was never clear to me that Iran absolutely wanted to establish a good relationship with the new Iraq. Iran absolutely wanted to make sure to see the Shia empowered in Iraq. Iran absolutely wanted to make sure that Iraq never again could become a platform, would again threaten Iran. That the Iraqi government would threaten Iran, or that Iraq would become a platform that could threaten Iran. But it's not clear to me that the Iranians weren't willing to share. I don't think that in 2003, 2004, in those years, it wasn't clear to me that the Iranians ever expected that Iraq wouldn't also have an important place in the Arab world. That just because a Shia-led Iraq was friends with Iran, that it wasn't also had important relations with its Arab neighbors. So it wasn't ever clear to me that Iran wasn't willing to share, so to speak. But if in the deeply polarized environment that took shape, really, especially after the Arab Spring, in the deeply polarized Sunni Shia Arab Iranian polarization that took place, if it wasn't possible for Iraq to straddle both camps, then the Iranians absolutely wanted Iraq to be in their camp. That's my impression, and in that respect, an earlier version of the book's title was A Self-Fulfilling Prophecy: The Saudi Struggle for Iraq. That's the current title is A Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, the Saudi Struggle for Iraq. An earlier title, my working title, was A Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, How Saudi Arabia Pushed Iraq into Iran's Arms. And you really could, I could have said, that subtitle could have been How Saudi Arabia Pushed Iraq into Iran's Open Arms. Because, Iran's arms were absolutely open. And the Saudis did a lot of the work for them and, pushing Iraq towards them.
In your conclusion, I don't want to give away, I don't want to give away the end of the story.
Because it really is a story.
But in your conclusion, you ask a number of questions.
Yeah.
About, think what would have or what might have happened had the Saudis handled the situation differently.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about that? In other words, as you think over the last 15 years,
yeah,
had the Saudis been more open to establishing a relationship with Baghdad, what might have been the implications for ISIS? What might have been the implications in the Arab Spring and with Syria?
Yeah.
There are a number of events that have transpired partially because of those fundamental decisions that Abdullah made in that 2003 to 6 period.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is, so, I've been working on this book in one way, shape, or one form or another, for the, since 2015, or earlier. And as kind of like the picture really kind of formed in my head of what I thought was going on, that was really the kind of the thing that I came back to was, what would have happened? And obviously there's no answer. If the Saudis had made a different decision, what would Iraq have looked like? And I should say, Iraq is a tough place. So it's not like Saudi engagement would have, again, that Iraq would have become a land of that it would have changed everything, that that Iraq would become a land of peace and harmony. But I think that it was deeply impactful. And that's kind of my argument, that this lack of Saudi normalization was really deeply impactful on Iraq. And it stripped Iraq of that Arab legitimacy. That was the thing. And I think it, and groups inside Iraq who, and I will say that, I think that, just as Maliki and, many of Iraqis believe that, Iraq, that Abdullah, was fundamentally hostile to Iraq's new Shia-led order. That's also my argument, that that Abdullah was fundamentally hostile to Iraq's new Shia-led order. And it's also become my belief that I think that he was looking to reverse those changes, at least restore some semblance of the old order, not the old order itself. And I think that groups in Iraq that were also not willing to accept the new order in Baghdad, it gave them heart. It heartened them that there was that Iraq's southern neighbor, perhaps the most important Arab state, was also holding out. Was not agreeing to legitimize these changes in Baghdad. And so obviously this is a counterfactual, so you can't ever know what would have happened, what might have been, but you can see, again, it's not like everybody would have come together and sung Kumbaya, but you could see that, you could see the potential for another insurgency post 2003 not taking, post Arab Spring not taking place, really the 2010 elections were a real turning point in, I believe, and really are sort of a turning point in the book. And again, not that Maliki was some paragon of virtue, he was not. But, at the time of the 2010 elections, and this was like the real irony about the Saudis' policy, at the time of the 2010 elections, Maliki, had formed his own list for the elections, was resisting joining, an Iranian-backed list. He saw that as detrimental for Iraq to join, a sectarian Iranian-backed list. So the dynamic was that, Maliki was trying to distance himself from Iran, but the Saudis were paradoxically trying to undermine Maliki, I believe. So the unfortunate dynamic was that, instead of sort of accepting Maliki, as other Arab leaders were encouraging them to do, again, not because Maliki is some paragon of virtue, he's not, but, other Arab leaders were also encouraging the Saudis to accept Maliki. But, if the Saudis had accepted Maliki, you could see that, Maliki's second government having turned out differently. I'll leave it at that. But that really, those questions that you bring up, those are the questions that I've sort of had with me for these many years of, writing this book, and there's no answer, but, you could see things having gone differently if the Saudis had made a different decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course you can extrapolate, and you're absolutely right. I mean, what would the impact have been, for example, on the Arab League? And part of the outcome of the Arab Spring was really the loss of influence of the traditional Sunni governments in larger Arab framework. The Egyptians turned inward, the Iraqis, were obviously preoccupied with their own issues. Syria in the midst of a civil war. So the powers that have been dominant in the Arab Ummah for all of those years suddenly were gone, and it fell to the Saudis and the Emiratis really to pick up the slack. And really to become the leaders that they had been reluctant to be for all of those years. And we can kind of think through what the implications might be for that. But I wanted to ask you whether you find it ironic at this point that that we now have the Iraqis who are taking the lead in trying to promote some kind of a dialogue and maybe conflict resolution, or at least mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, no, I think that it's really, for the Iraqis, it makes a lot of sense, particularly given the last 10, 15 years. The Iraqis really see themselves, understandably, I think, as having been one of the battlegrounds, the victim, one of the victims of this Saudi-Iranian rivalry. So, it is very much in their interest to do all that they can to mute that, and I think for the Iraqis, Iraq is a diverse place, and it's predominantly Arab, and it's predominantly, or at least majority, Shia. And, I think the Iraqis, and understandably, want to have a good relationship with Iran, but also want to have good relationships with their Arab neighbors. I don't think that I think, going back to Maliki, who's really sort of, the period of his premiership is really the focus of my study. I think that was Maliki's point of view was, he was never anti-Iran. I say that he was independent of Iran, at least in his first government. That, he saw Iraq as, having a foot in both camps. And I think that's true of all of, the subsequent governments, Abadi, Adel Abdul Mahdi, very much Qadami today, is that, Iraq wants to have good relationships with both. And this, makes sense because it has, important ties to both. And so, anything that they can do to kind of bring the two sides together, because, Iraq suffers when they are forced to take sides. And that's kind of what happened in the post-2003, but really the post-Arab Spring period, was that they were forced to take sides. They felt threatened by the Arab side, by Saudi Arabia, and they, wound up in an Iranian camp. But, I think Iraq wants to be in a position where it doesn't have to take sides, and where it, brings the two sides together so that it can maintain its flexibility in that regard. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see to what extent the Iraqis are successful. I mean, there is no guarantee.
No, there's no guarantee, and certainly everything we hear from the Saudis is that they have very low expectations.
Yeah.
But obviously, talking is better than not talking. So that's a question.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a little time left, and I wonder. I mean, the other part of your book is really this kind of psychological analysis of leadership and how decision making is made, and you talk about kind of the three forms for decision making, or the three structures for decision making. There's the great leader. Who is the decision maker, and that was clearly the case in Saudi Arabia with King Abdullah. Then you have, structures where there's an inner circle that's making decisions and working things out, and then you have another circle, another format where you have people coming in from various outside elements who are all influencing decision making, and things become a little chaotic. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, and how how you used, as you said, how you used this process in Riyadh as kind of a case study for decision making?
So and again, because this book really started out as a PhD dissertation, I had to have a theoretical framework. And because I was looking at a foreign policy decision, I was looking at kind of the decision-making, frameworks, which are really, unsurprisingly, what exists in the scholarship is really geared towards American foreign policy and how decisions are made in the American system. And that's, really the bureaucratic politics model, how, kind of these entities within the US federal government come together and there's an output, and, and of course that really does not translate into the Saudi system. And I found a framework that was originally formulated by a scholar named Margaret Herman. And it's a framework for decision-making that really is geared to be applicable to like any state. And Herman points to sort of three entities, three possible constellations of decision-making within a state. The first possibility is that of a predominant leader. As we were just saying, the situation that I found under Abdullah, that there's, a predominant leader who is responsible for taking the decision. Another second possibility is, a small group is responsible sort of collectively for taking decisions. An example of that is sort of the Politburo in the old Soviet Union. And you could also say that, and the third possibility is, I think it's a coalition of autonomous actors, and that's when things become much more chaotic. That there's, there are a lot of entities within the state, and they all sort of kind of jostle among each other to take decisions. And you can have a coalition of autonomous actors who operate with rules, or autonomous actors that don't operate with rules. And that's when there's really this rivalry, within the state for who is responsible for foreign policy. And what was particularly interesting for the Saudi case, and I'm particularly looking at the post-2003 period, but I do look really kind of the post from the 1970s onwards. What was really interesting was that throughout that kind of the last 40, 50 years, you see manifestations within the Saudi system of each of those constellations at various points emerging. So, if Mohammed bin Salman today is sort of predominant leader, what the framework would say is that King Salman is actually the predominant leader, but he is deferred to Mohammed bin Salman. But Abdullah was predominant leader. But during the period that Fahd was king, and Fahd really relied on his Suderi brothers, his full brothers. And you could see kind of more collective decision making taking place in that period with the Suderis. So that's an instance of sort of a different constellation within the Saudi system. And then, there are also periods where there's real, rivalries within the Saudi system. We've seen that most recently, in Saudi Arabia, after the death of Abdullah, in the couple of years before Mohammed bin Salman consolidated power, there was these rivalries, significant rivalries. But the same thing happened. King Fahd had a stroke in 1995 that left him completely incapacitated. Abdullah, who was not a Suderi, Abdullah was a half-brother of Fahd. Abdullah, despite the fact that he had been crown prince since 1982, he was never somebody he was always a rival of Fahd and a rival of the Suderis. And so he was somebody who actually had really sort of been distanced from decision-making, foreign policy decision-making at the very least. And so from 1995 on, for the next couple of years, with Fahd being just taken out of the picture with his stroke, there was then this intense rivalry between Abdullah and Sultan and the Suderis. And so that was, again, this kind of period where you can see kind of hints that Saudi decision-making operated as a coalition of autonomous actors who were operating without rules. And so the point being that the Saudi system over the past however many decades has sort of, the decision-making framework has sort of oftentimes been in this state of flux, and it's really a reflection of who the personalities are at the top of the Saudi pyramid. Saudi Arabia is a state that is low on the institutionalization scale, and the personalities. It's really revolves around these key personalities, and so decision making is a reflection of who the personalities are at the top of the Saudi state.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when when people aren't forced to fit themselves into the bureaucratic peg holes,
right.
then anything goes, huh?
Yeah.
And you also talk a little bit about the sidelining during the Fahd and Suderi period, the sidelining of Saud al-Faisal.
Yeah.
Who was considered outside of Saudi Arabia to be one of the most capable, competent foreign ministers in the world. And yet within Saudi Arabia was perceived primarily as a potential rival for leadership once they skipped to the next, the generation of the grandchildren.
Yeah, that was a real interesting, again, I had seen Saud al-Faisal, before my research, as exactly as you say. He was like, oh, he's been this important figure for 40 years. I mean, he had been this important figure for 40 years, but within the Saudi family, Fahd saw him as a significant rival. And that became clear in my research.
Yeah. So I in the possibility that I'm painting outside the lines, and that it's a bit of an unfair question, but I will draw on your experience in UCOM as my excuse. I mean, how do you interpret all of your leadership studies to what's going on inside of Moscow right now?
Yeah, I think that so I profess no expertise on Putin or on Russian decision making. I am mostly a spectator, a very sorry spectator. But in terms of the parallels, what parallels I can just draw whatever that it's clear that I was saying that Abdullah, I think, felt deeply aggrieved about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and that was an important component as well about his decision. That it was this deep grievance, and it's become extremely clear that that Putin is very deeply aggrieved about the fall of the Soviet Union and the way that the Cold War ended, and very deeply aggrieved with regard to Ukraine. Ukraine has become sort of this symbol for him, in the way that for Abdullah, Maliki became a symbol for Abdullah. Maliki really became kind of epitomized for Abdullah everything that was wrong with the new Iraq. Again, not to say that Maliki was a paragon of virtue. He was not, but Maliki became the scapegoat. And it seems like in a way, Ukraine has become the scapegoat for Putin. Political psychologists will tell us that unfortunately, we humans, we are capable of changing our minds. But in order to change our minds, we have to want to, or we have to at least be willing to change our minds. Feelings come first, and in situations where these feelings are extremely deep and extremely negative, we oftentimes don't have the willingness to change our minds. And I think that helps explain Abdullah. He unfortunately, he was not willing to change his mind. And I think the same goes with Putin. I think that these grievances appear extremely deep for Putin, and he doesn't seem, he has now gone so far beyond the pale of what's acceptable in the international community, at least among, the West. But he does not seem to be somebody who's willing to change his mind. He's just completely fixated on his view of the world. I will say also that I look at the invasion of Ukraine, in the same, there are parallels, not only with the U.S. invasion of Iraq. There's a parallel in particular with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. That was, the Iraqi invasion of Iran was an enormous miscalculation, but the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990 was a huge miscalculation that was really the decision of one man, and that was Saddam Hussein. And I know from Iraqi friends that, they woke up that morning in August 1990 and were like, what just, they were shocked by the news. And obviously not only did the Kuwaitis suffer tremendously as a result of the invasion, but, the Iraqis really suffered tremendously. Throughout the 1990s, Iraq then came under this onerous sanctions regime, and Iraqis really tremendously suffered as a result of Saddam's, just complete miscalculation of invading Kuwait. And obviously I feel primarily for the people of Ukraine, but I also feel for, the people of Russia too. I mean, a lot of them seem to be buying the, Putin's propaganda, but, but particularly for the Russians who, are not buying the propaganda, if Putin isn't gotten rid of, quite frankly, Russia will become a pariah, and understandably so, at least within the West. And I feel tremendously for, ordinary Russians. I completely understand why a lot of ordinary Russians, tens of thousands of Russians, from what I understand, have gotten out of Russia. I was reading a great article in the Times a couple of days ago that you saw as well, and the article ended with a Russian who had fled to Turkey just in the last couple of days, weeks. This young woman said, the Russians who fled Russia in 1920 during the Russian Revolution, they ended up better than the Russians who stayed in the Soviet Union. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the present situation, for what they're worth.
No, absolutely, and I think we've given you the germ for Self-Fulfilling Prophecy Volume 2. So.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's fascinating. The misperception. Just to how we're not objective beings. We human beings. We form perceptions, and we're often mistaken. And so this is a study about misperception in the international system, and the ramifications of misperception.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Kitty, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Thank you. I was delighted.
No, it was a great conversation, and again, a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it is available at Amazon books, and discount codes are posted.
Yeah, and there are 2 discount codes that should be posted. In the US, the publisher is Oxford University Press. In the UK and overseas, it's Hearst Publishers. And so there are 2 discount codes for both of those. But I think there are also discounts currently on Amazon. So anyway, lots of ways to buy the book.
and by all means, I've had the opportunity to go through it, and it's a fascinating tale. So thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for joining in this morning and sharing